I just sent the invite. Got it? Okay. Okay. If you, because what usually I do, so I won't hear both of them, I'll put like earphones on for my computer for the Zoom meeting, and then for the live, I'll just have it going regular. So I think that usually kind of like keeps it from delaying. Okay. 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 All right. Gotcha. All right. So everything seems to be working cool. So let me start the Zoom. Start recording the Zoom. Oh. All right. Let me check. All right. Gotcha. Gotcha. I accepted it. All right. I see you now. All right. Peace. What's going on?
Peace. I'm good.
All right, man. So first and foremost, let me just say, man, it's an honor to speak to you, my brother. Peace and blessings. Um, I've been studying a little bit of everything for a very long time, and I came across you when I was seeking knowledge on the 5% Nation of Gods and Earths.
Hmm.
So much of what I initially learned in my journey was based upon your videos on YouTube, man. So I really appreciate speaking to you. Yeah, yeah. So I really appreciate speaking to you. It's an honor to be here with you, man.
I appreciate that. That's peace.
All right, so let me just, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to go over some of the things that you sent me for your bio. Can't go over everything because you had so many accomplishments and you put in so much work. But I'm just going to read an abbreviated version of it real quick. And basically, what I'm speaking to right now is Brother Saladin Allah. He's the founder of the Atlantis School for Gifted Youngsters in Niagara Falls, New York. He spent years as a freelance writer and radio host, as well as a youth advocate, creating several youth programs and initiatives. Brother Saladin has also published 23 books through his Quadna Publishing and through his Atlantis School website. He has published over 350 articles on a variety of subjects. Five of his books are now part of the Curatorial Activism Archive in the British Library. He worked in film, television, and he's also released 4 full-length albums. So yeah, this is a brother who puts in a lot of work, and we appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you, G. Side note. Did you start recording on Zoom yet?
Yes, I did.
Okay, cool.
All right. So let me just begin by saying that what we're talking about is, can you turn down the Instagram? Or do you have like earbuds
Yeah.
that you can connect to it?
Yeah. Hold on. Okay, go ahead. I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so basically, what we're talking about is the influence and the impact of Islam in hip hop. And first, I want to start off by asking, what exactly do we mean when we say Islam? Because we have Nation of Gods and Earths and their idea of Islam and their theology, as well as the Nation of Islam, their theology. Then we have Sunni Islam, which also had an impact. So when we say Islam, and when you say Islam, what exactly does that entail?
Yeah. Hold on for 1 second,
Okay,
brother. Let me put these in because it sounds like it's an echo right
okay,
now.
that may be on my end.
It's on me too.
And usually when I put the earphones on, that kind of like deadens it. I don't know what's going on with it.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear it clear. Yeah. Yeah. Got you.
Okay.
Okay. So, pardon self, G. Could you repeat the question
Yes,
again?
I was basically asking when we say Islam,
Hmm?
what do we mean by Islam? Because we know that, the Nation of Gods and Earths has a very distinct theology. We know that brothers in the East who are Sunni Muslim, they may have their own distinct theology. So when we talk about the impact of Islam on hip hop, what do we mean by Islam?
Wow. So it really depends on who you're asking.
Hmm.
So if you're talking to a person that would be considered Nuwabian and they're followers of Dr. York, they're going to have a certain perspective of what you mean by Islam. If you're talking to brothers or sisters who are part of the Moorish community, they're going to have a different perspective. People who are part of the Nation of Islam, people who are Sunni, 5%. Um, and I would say, regardless of those various different perspectives, we're talking about peace.
Mhm.
And that's probably the fundamental way to express what that means. Now, how people arrive at that form of peace or how they articulate that peace may differ, but ultimately, that's what it ultimately comes down to. That it's about peace.
Gotcha. Understood.
Hmm.
Now, one of the things that always fascinated me is the fact that there is an Islam over here from the West that has such a huge impact on the Black community, and then we have an Eastern Islam, what they would refer to as Orthodox Islam. What are
Hmm.
the differences between the Eastern and the Western Islam?
So now, if you're talking about Islam, are you speaking about from a religious perspective? Are you speaking about it from a non-religious perspective?
Well,
Because
well,
yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
the term that I use is theology,
Okay.
simply because the term theology I think can um be used for somebody who's religious or somebody who's not religious.
Hmm.
So that's why I use the term theology.
Yeah, I think one of the more apparent distinctions is when you look at the star and the moon. From the west, the moon is a waning moon. But when you look at, I'm sorry, when you look at the east, that is a waning moon. But when you look at the west, it's a waxing moon, which means the direction that the moon is actually facing on the flag is entirely different.
Mhm.
Usually, when you see Islamic flags in the east, the moon is facing in an eastern direction.
Right.
But when you look at a lot of the sects of Islam here in the West, our moon is facing a western direction.
Oh, okay.
You
Okay.
know, that's one thing that you see that's primarily distinctive in terms of how Islam is actually viewed.
Hmm.
It's viewed from a Western perspective, or we've been exposed to Islam in a way that was more native or phenotypical to not only our circumstances here in North America, but also our experience as a people here. And that was much more culturally congruent with our
Gotcha.
experiences here in North America. And that's something that's very distinct. And it's also something that you see when you go to the East, because you look at Muslims who are in Saudi Arabia or Dubai, but then you look at some Muslims who are in Senegal
Hmm.
and other different places in West Africa. They have different ways in which they express it in terms of their culture.
Okay.
So it's no different than that in a sense, where we don't dress like people in Saudi Arabia typically
Right.
over here. We
Hmm.
have a totally different environment, a different geographic location. We speak a different language.
Yeah, and we have different needs as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm. So, that's one thing that I think is important for anyone to consider when they're striving to study what they would term Islam,
Hmm.
that you have it being expressed in different ways based upon the time frame, the geographic location, the languages, and like you mentioned, the needs of the people where they live at.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Hmm.
On your on the Instagram, I can't see your face on the Instagram. It's like, can you move the phone over just a little bit? Okay, there we
Yeah.
go. Yeah, now I can see you. Excellent.
Okay.
Okay. So my next question is, who were the most influential teachers of Islam in the West, and what made them so influential?
Oh, well, you can't talk about Islam in the West if you don't mention the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Um, he's basically one of the foundations of Islam as taught to people of African descent or original people here in North America. You had others, but most is traced back to him primarily.
Right.
And you see a lot of various different movements that actually spawn from him.
Hmm.
Now, he was taught by a man by the name of W.D. Farad. Some people also refer to him as Master Farad Muhammad. But as his student, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad really established what came to be known as the Nation of Islam. And there are many people who have been influenced from the Nation of Islam, even if they didn't maintain a religious perspective. You know, they definitely learned principles and values that they were exposed to by the work of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad in the early 1930s. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. And how did Western Islam become so much a part of hip hop culture from the very beginning?
Wow. So one thing I think is important also to understand is when we talk about hip hop culture and it becoming a movement in the 1970s, we're talking about the children of the Black Power movement and of the Civil Rights movement. These are the children of these movements. And you see a lot of those elements in the foundation of hip hop in terms of self-determination, a sense of pride and originality. There are 5 original elements of hip hop. The 5th element is known as knowledge of self, and that is primarily where people learn this sense of self-identity, sense of pride, cultural competence. And from the 70s going all the way into the 80s and into the 90s, you have that golden era of hip hop, which was primarily teaching about these things related to identity and self-esteem, a sense of community. Even the names that we used during those time periods were reflective of those type of principles and values and the mindset that we had. It was very common to see people named Divine or Supreme or Queen. It was very, very, very rare that you would hear women referring to themselves or being called out of their names.
Right.
Because we were orientated a different way. And this was before the culture became corporatized. You know,
Gotcha.
so when we're talking about Islam, we're talking about the children of the Black Power as well as the Civil Rights Movement who already were growing up in an environment where those family dynamics were exposed to them. And that's one reason why a lot of the earliest music that you hear in hip hop was sampled from the same records that they grew up in listening to in their own household.
Right.
And a lot of those records and albums, whether you're talking about James Brown and being Black and Proud, or you're talking about any of these other different groups, look at groups like Earth, Wind and Fire.
Right.
Cool and the Gang were a part of the Nation of Islam.
I didn't know that.
Oh my God. They had an album called Light of the World. They had a popular song called Fruit Man where they were teaching you in the 70s about how to eat to live.
I gotta check that out.
They got another song called Heaven at Once. And they talk about, you know, having a sense of righteousness, and they were literally putting that in their music before celebration. And that was the norm. So this is the kind of background music that children of hip hop were listening to and what they were actually being exposed to. So you can see why a lot of those elements were infused within the foundation of hip hop culture being created. As the 5%, our movement started in 1964. And again, you had younger people who were a part of the 5%, and these were many of the earliest practitioners of hip hop culture in all of its elements.
Right.
And the same way that we use our language of supreme mathematics and we talk about dropping knowledge or sciencing things up, or we stand in a cipher with our right hand over our left, you can see how these particular gestures and these traditions were incorporated within hip hop, where now you see people stand in a cipher, and a lot of people don't even know where that comes from.
Right.
You know, or standing on a square.
Yeah. I remember when I was young, I would rhyme, and we would stand in a circle and we would rhyme, and we would call it a cipher. I didn't even know why we called it a cipher until I got older, because the language and the slang had become embedded as much a part of hip hop. I didn't even know where it came from, but I just knew that we would stand in a cipher and just rhyme all day. I didn't even know that
Mm-hmm.
came from the 5%ers. I had no idea
Mm-hmm.
until I was like 30 or something like that when I finally found that out.
Mm-hmm. And that's the fifth element of hip hop, and five in our supreme mathematics represents power.
Right.
So you can see how through the corporatizing of hip hop culture and the monetization of rap, you also saw the segregation and eventually the destruction of some of the other different elements
Right.
that weren't seen as profitable, such as the fifth element being knowledge itself, because now you have people who are conscious of what is going on in their environment, and they are being encouraged to do something about it. So
Gotcha.
I grew up in that time period, going up through the 80s, and I'm listening to hearing the X Clan and KRS-One in the form of Boogie Down Productions and Poor Righteous Teachers and Brand Nubian and Rakim and Slick Rick and all of these artists that are exposing us to a sense of social consciousness. And again, these are the children of the Black Power and the Civil Rights Movement who are creating this culture.
Got you. Right. 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 And you said a lot that I want to unpack, but I just want to go back and just ask this real quick. So we know that you mentioned the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad as a person who was really, really influential as far as spreading Western Islam. Um, were there any other Islamic groups or organizations that had an impact on hip hop, other than the Nation of Islam and the Nation of Gods and Earths?
So as children growing up in Naui or New York City, you also begin to see cultural cross-pollination,
Mm-hmm.
where you had various different elements culturally being disseminated amongst various different people and in different communities. So you
Mm-hmm.
had groups like the Zulu Nation that began to incorporate elements of the 5% in the supreme mathematics in what they were teaching. You also saw the development of the Ansar community, which came to be known as the Nuwabians, where they
Mm-hmm.
begin to incorporate various different elements that they learned from the 5%, that they learned from the Nation of Islam. So you had many different groups or sects or orders, as you would call them, that
Mm-hmm.
begin to evolve out of this cultural cross-pollination of youth coming together and practicing these five elements.
Gotcha. And when these different orders of Islam were kind of like coexisting, did they coexist peacefully? Was there like a little bit of conflict between them because they may have had different perspectives?
Yeah,
What
you
did
had
you observe?
you had both.
Mm-hmm.
You had times where people were peace, and then you had times where there was a little bit of conflict. So, for example, you look at um, groups like KMD,
Mm-hmm.
and KMD were mostly affiliated with the Ansar community, right? But they were also cool with other different hip hop artists that may have not been affiliated with the Ansar community, but they would collaborate and make music together.
Mm-hmm.
Even when you go later on into the 90s and stuff, you see the Wu-Tang Clan, not all of the members of the Wu-Tang Clan are 5%ers. You
Mm-hmm.
have some members who are Muslims, but they come together and they make music together. You look at the native tongues. You had various different people that were exposed to different aspects of Islam, and there was a common cause that they shared because hip hop as a culture is what drew them together. So you've seen that demonstration of unity, but you also saw divisiveness at times as well.
Mm-hmm.
You think about the schism that went on between the X Clan and Boogie Down Productions, or
Right.
you
Right.
look at the schism that was happening between Poor Righteous Teachers and this group, or this group and that group. A lot of that was really fanned by the media,
Right.
but there were some moments in hip hop history where people didn't necessarily get along, just like any family members.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a level of unity during that golden era that, since that time, has never been duplicated. And I keep referring back to just the corporatizing of hip hop as a culture,
Mm-hmm.
because now when money and corporate interests became a part of that equation, you have people who are now starting to make decisions that were not putting our relationships with one another as the highest value, and more thinking about materialism and what they can get for themselves. Even in the language, like during that time period in the 80s and in the 90s, you didn't hear people saying, I got mine, you need to get yours.
Right.
I mean, Tupac and MC Breed eventually came out with a song with that as a hook. You got to get yours, I got to get mine. But prior to that, that wasn't even a part of the hip hop lexicon. That wasn't even a part of our nomenclature. We didn't talk like that.
Right. Right.
But again, once you start adding money into the equation, now you have people who starting to think along the lines of, I can be a self-made man or a self-made woman.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. One of the most interesting things about Islam and hip hop is the dedication to making the truth known. And a lot of things that were concealed from Black people, hip hop and Islam brought the truth to the forefront, brought the knowledge to the forefront. Did you ever notice, or did you ever see that there were some people who were a little bit concerned because some of the things that were being taught were esoteric knowledge? Because like the idea of the God being the self, the idea of seeking yourself and having that once, this is esoteric. Like this is stuff that a lot of people may not have been ready for. Did you ever see anybody ever voice concern like, whoa, the masses ain't ready for this yet, or maybe we should hold back on some of the knowledge?
That was mostly going over people's head, because keep in mind, rap as an element of hip hop wasn't even respected or even looked at as music. It's crazy. When I talk to younger people today, I tell them, do you know it was a time that they wouldn't even play rap music on the radio? And they said that it was jungle music. They wouldn't even play it on the radio. It's hard for them to conceptualize that because you see rap music in every aspect of life. Every aspect of life. Whether they're selling toothpaste or whether you see them selling an app, or it's always something related to monetization or something they can commercialize. But at one point, rap music wasn't even seen as music. So it was very not only minimized and discarded, but people were very dismissive about it. And there was a level of freedom in expressing ourselves that way musically because there was no censorship. We can say what we want. And I'm talking about before there were videos.
Right.
And if you wanted to get music, you had to get it on a cassette tape. So people had a level of freedom in terms of expressing themselves that media outlets and corporate interests were not paying attention to.
Right.
But then when we got on the actual radar of corporate interests and the media, and people started to see movements developing around this consciousness that was evolving in the youth that was similar. Again, we're talking about the children of the Black rights, the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement. We start to see that same consciousness developing in these children. Oh, we got to do something about it now.
Right.
Before, it's like, yeah, this ain't even music. We ain't even paying attention to this.
Right.
Or they scratching records. Yeah, whatever. I don't care what that is. Or they doing these type of dances like that. It was very, the mainstream media and the status quo had a very dismissive attitude about it.
Right.
So because of that dismissive attitude, we had a level of freedom to express ourselves. And it wasn't until we got on the radar of mainstream media and corporate interests, aka ultimately the government, that now you started to see the surveillance of the content and the cultural competence that was being expressed through the music. Now we need to pay attention, which also means now you also start seeing plants being a part of this culture and reporting back to the government and to these other agencies in order to inform them about the direction that we're going in.
Wow, yeah, you're right.
And then on top of that, the same exact tactic that you saw happening in the Black Power movement and in the Civil Rights movement, where you have this propaganda campaign where now people are starting to be fearful and frightened about what's going on and all this other stuff. And, the same thing you were talking about, where it's like, oh, no, we don't need to be, sharing so much or saying too much.
Mm-hmm.
The exact
Right.
same thing. The same playbook was used
Right.
on
Right.
on the parents and the grandparents of the children who created hip hop. The
Right.
same playbook.
That's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I remember one time I was doing some research on the early days of the Nation of Islam and the Moorish Science Temple. If you look at the I believe it's the CIA website and their archives, it'll actually show where they sent in spies who would go into the temples and actually learn the lessons. And I saw like an FBI file that had like the Moorish Science Temple, their lessons. I'm like, wow, that's crazy. Did you ever see anything like that where somebody went into hip hop and learned the slang and infiltrated? Did you ever see anything like that or hear any stories like that?
All the time.
Wow.
All the time. Formally and informally.
Right.
So I say formally because you have people who are actually being paid by agencies to go in there and do this.
Wow.
You have some people who are informally doing it because they're uneducated.
Right.
And they're following the exact same script, the same way we see today. Like you see artists who are putting out music that if you sat and actually studied their lyrics, that is an indictment. Or they can literally teach you how to sell drugs. Or if you want to actually be a human trafficker,
Mm-hmm.
you can read certain lyrics and it gives you the blueprint of how to be this type of person.
Right.
Who does that benefit putting this type of information out here to the general public? You know what I'm saying? So some people, they're deliberately being financed to do this, and there's others who think it's cool to do it, not realizing that you are actually putting people in jeopardy, especially our younger generation that are at a very critical stage in their growth and development where they're striving to find their way. And
Mm-hmm.
now they have to sift through all of this misinformation and disinformation to find themselves in the process. We had a benefit of growing up at a time period where the background music and the access to resources and information fed our souls in such a way where we had more of a positive outlook on life.
Mm-hmm.
And living in that kind of environment where we can listen to certain music and it's actually educating us and giving us a sense of pride and ethics and a sense of a moral compass and all of those important qualities that we still possess to this day.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of our children today don't have access to any of that.
Right. Right.
And it only benefits those who are making money perpetuating these negative images of who we are that they don't even promote to their own children.
You're right about that. I remember I used to have a job where I was working at a drug rehab facility for adolescents, and I remember one of the young men got caught with some narcotics, and he of course told them I use the narcotics, so they sent him. He was selling them, but he said I use them, and they sent him to where I was working. And I remember he said he got caught because he was selling narcotics on his iPhone, and at the time there was a song called "Selling Dope on My iPhone." And I'm like, "Was you listening to that?" He told me he was listening to that song, and that's where he got the idea from. So the cops came, took his iPhone, list the customers, list the transactions right there. But fortunately, he was able to, he was young, so he didn't get caught up in that situation. Thank goodness.
Wow,
but that's crazy. I'm like, and I think it was a Rick Ross song. I'm like, how could somebody just put this in a song? I'm selling dope on my iPhone, think kids hear it, and this. I thought that was the most insane thing I ever heard in my life.
Yeah, that's crazy,
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, I'm thankful to grow up in a time where I can hear a song called My Philosophy and even think about the word philosophy. Mm-hmm. The average child that you know today, if you ask them to spell the word philosophy, they may not be able to do it, or they may not know what it even means because it's not an actual part of their lexicon. Mm-hmm. So just being exposed to certain nomenclature at that time period also constructed our brain architecture in a way that is very different than the way in which the brain architecture of our children and our children's children is being constructed today. Because they're not hearing songs called My Philosophy.
Right. You're right.
You know what I mean? Or none
Mm-hmm.
of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole different soundtrack to their life.
Yeah. Crazy. So one question I wanted to ask you was about the term knowledge itself. When I was in my reading and my studies, the term knowledge itself the earliest I could find that term was from a Sufi mystic named Ibn Arabi. He used the term knowledge itself.
Hmm.
Where do you think hip hop fits in on the continuum of Islamic mysticism?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So I've always seen us as urban Sufis,
Okay.
urban mystics. And that is to say, that perspective of life in the form of in a form of hip hop is just more of a contemporary expression. Because when you study some of the mystics of the past, especially Sufis, you see that they were doing the exact same thing during different time periods, a different language. They were also considered on the fringes of society or outcasted,
Hmm.
incorporating music and other different elements within what would be considered worship,
Hmm.
the same way that we do as well. And you see that in various different places around the world. So when you're talking about that continuum of Islamic mysticism, what you see that has happened with the evolution of hip hop is consistent with what you see that Hazrat Inayat Khan was actually talking about in India,
Hmm.
or what you see in the tales of Nasruddin in Pakistan, or El Halaj and him talking about he is the truth, the
Hmm.
personification of what that is. You see all of those different elements within hip
Yeah.
hop. Just a
Yeah. I
different
believe.
time period, different
Yeah.
language.
Yeah. I believe El Halaj was El Halaj the one who said, "Beneath my robe, there's nothing but glory." Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's the origins of the God self that
Yes.
became a part of the hip hop. Okay. That's powerful.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
powerful.
It's all consistent. It's all
Yeah. And
consistent, you know?
even the term poor righteous teacher, like, a lot of those brothers that had taken vows of poverty, like this guy named Saravardi who came up with the philosophy of illuminationism. He did the same thing. He said, I'm just gonna be a poor righteous teacher. He lived in poverty, went around teaching people, giving people knowledge. So
Hmm.
it's, yeah, you're right. It's the same thing. After
Hmm.
all these millennia.
Yep. 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 And if you study a lot of the writings of Idris Shah,
Hmm.
he actually breaks down also the use of what we consider supreme mathematics,
Okay.
supreme alphabets. Sufis of that time period were also utilizing Islamic or Quranic verses in a coded way.
Okay.
The same way that you would have people who would be considered like Christian scientists or dealing with the science of Christ consciousness, they
Hmm.
would utilize biblical scriptures and see the coded language within biblical scriptures. You see the
Right.
same thing with how people use the Vedas and all of these other different
Right.
sacred books, sacred texts, but it's all consistent across the board. But in order to see that common thread and that underlining significance, you have to be studied, you have to be studious, and you have to be willing to learn of a lot of these various different perspectives. And I think that's also one of the flaws with some people who are religious, because having a certain belief system and being committed to some things, they may not be willing to open their minds and to learn and to listen to other people's perspectives, to
Right.
see that common unity or that underlying significance through all things.
Hmm.
You know?
Right. Right. You ain't lying about that. That's definitely true.
Hmm.
So another one of my questions is, and I want to segue into what you've been mentioning. A consistent thing you mentioned is the corporatization of hip hop and the monetization of hip hop
Hmm.
music. I guess my question, I want to start off with the question is, do you feel that life imitates art, and do you feel that if if life imitates art, do you feel like there should be restrictions on what an artist can and can't say?
Mm. So life imitates art, and then art also imitates life.
Hmm.
You know, um, in terms of censorship, I think that is important, but the problem with that is who is the standard and authority to censor? And
Right.
unfortunately, we oftentimes rely on on a group of people or a societal standard
Hmm.
that is not the most just, that historically has never been the most fair,
Hmm.
to be this moral compass and this code of ethics to tell us what should be censored and what should not be censored. you know. So I think ultimately teaching our children the appropriate way and giving them the proper principles and values allows them to be critical thinkers and to make decisions within the parameters of their culture or their way of life, which doesn't require censorship. So, for example, I don't go to strip clubs or anything like that. You know, there's other places I don't go or certain things that I'm not into that I just simply don't do. And that's just the way that I'm orientated, right? So for me, there are certain aspects of so-called censorship that just doesn't apply to me because that's not something I'm going to be saying and doing anyway.
Right.
You know, just the way my way of life is, I aspire to perfection. I aspire to be supreme in the things that I do. And there's just certain things that if I said it and did it, it would undermine my ability to fully express who I actually am. You know, but that's just how I learned and that's what I was taught. But you don't have many people who are being taught that. You know, you have people who are being taught culture with no bounds or no sense of temperance with how they're living.
Right.
So they just think they can do and say whatever they want. And even when they do that and get the consequences for their words and their actions, a lot of times they don't even want to accept that and realize that that is a direct result of what they were saying and doing. You know, a civilization is not just a interpersonal thing, but it's also it's just not a personal thing, but it's also interpersonal.
Right.
You know, we learn about how to evolve and develop in relationship to other human beings so that we can maintain those relationships and perpetuate humanity. And it also incorporates our relationship to the environment. There's not many people who are actually learning that. Right. You know, and because of that, we live in a society where we need certain type of regulations. You know, if we didn't have stop signs and stoplights, people be getting into accidents all of the time. You know, but you have some people that, regardless if it was a stoplight or a stop sign, they're conscientious enough to not smash into other vehicles and to be courteous enough to let another pass, you know, let another car or vehicle go by so that they can be patient enough to go after them. You have some people who naturally operate like that. But because we don't live in that kind of society, there has to be some regulations and censorship and all of those various different things. So, you know, so it's like a double-edged sword to me. You know, it's necessary. It's the same thing with like religion. Some people, they need religion in a way where they need to, and that's what I agree with in terms of the Sufi philosophy, that the greatest worship is the constant remembrance of Allah, to be the personification of Allah. But you have some people that they may need to break down and pray 5 times a day. Because all the other time throughout the day, their mind is not on Allah, or their mind is not on being one with their belief. So they need to constantly be reminded every, 5 times a day, you need to give God his glory. Right. But you have some people who live that out. And it's an insult to tell them that they need to stop 5 times a day to pay homage to something that they're in the constant remembrance of.
Gotcha. Right.
You know?
Right. True.
So some people need that censorship in religion, and some people that really doesn't apply to them.
Right. Gotcha. Well, let me play devil's advocate for a second, because one of the things that I'm consistently dealing with is the what's so bad about that argument. Like when I see videos with women being hypersexualized and the constant twerking and the constant, references to drug usage and intoxication and, men talking about busting their gun and all of this, it's like, okay, what's so bad about that in music? I'm just enjoying my music. I'm just having some fun. I'm just living life to the fullest. You only live once. What's so bad about that?
Yeah. So people who typically say that have not experienced the direct connection to how that influences their life. So in other words, they don't mind watching a video and seeing Sexy Red or whoever she is, or whoever twerking and all
Yeah.
that other stuff. They may
Yeah.
like that, but when they 10-year-old daughter is doing it in their house, they now it's a problem.
Right.
You know
Right.
what I'm
Right.
saying?
Right.
And it's like it's until it has a direct connection to some people, they oftentimes are very dismissive about certain things. You know, they may not busting your guns and all that other stuff. Yo, yeah, cool, I like that. But if that happens to one of their family members,
Right.
and
Right.
somebody
Right.
doing that, now they start to really think about how that influences their environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so yeah, you know, it's a lot of times it has to hit home for some people to see the value and the seriousness of certain things, and then
Mm-hmm.
to understand that just because it may not be personally affecting you, that it is affecting somebody in a negative way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and if you really care about your own child or your own family members, you should have that same consideration for other children and other family members. It
Right.
just ain't about you and yours.
Mm-hmm.
But if you wouldn't want your own children being exposed to certain things, why is it okay for other children who are probably your children's peers
Right. Right.
being
Right.
exposed to it too? You
Right.
know?
Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about it is that I had recently did a YouTube video,
Uh-huh.
actually a series of YouTube videos where I was talking about how our culture ended up where it is now, and so a lot of it started off with a guy named Alfred Kinsey, who was a sexologist, and he was a guy who wanted to promote all this free love stuff, but he used that as a means of promoting his secret agenda of pedophilia and a whole bunch of other insanity. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the scary things about it is that whole mentality of what's wrong with it always goes too far. It I don't know what something naturally about human beings who think like that. They always got to go a little further until they go too far, and that's the thing. Like it always leads to societal decline every single time.
Oh yeah, yeah. And when you're talking about societal decline, you're talking really about a certain group of people who identify a certain way. And what I'm talking about is you could take it back to the Greeks,
Mm-hmm.
and you can take it back to the Romans who came after them.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at the people in Europe. All of that was a part of their way of life. All of that was a part of their way of life.
Right.
There wasn't no distinction, you know, in terms of what would be considered sacred and what would be considered profane.
Right.
It just all was what it was.
Right.
And you saw the decline of those societies based upon it being a free for all.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
America
Absolutely.
is the new world. It is the child of Europe. So everything we see here, if you just take a glance or you just take a cursory glance through what was going on in Europe and what was going on in Rome and in
Mm-hmm.
Greece, you see the exact same thing. The exact
Yeah.
same thing, because this is their society.
True.
This is their
True.
society.
True.
And everything that would be good and cool back then is also acceptable here, which ultimately led to the decline of the society.
Yeah. True.
You
True.
know?
As a matter of fact, when I was a young kid, they used to teach us, and it goes to show you how in sync they were. They used to teach us civilization started in Greece and Rome,
Mm-hmm.
and then as I got older, I realized that was a bold-faced lie. But in a way, they was telling the truth because their civilization, what they wanted, started in Greece and Rome. So you
Yeah,
100% correct.
they one time I think they asked Gandhi about what he thinks about Western civilization, and he was like, it would be a good thing, you know?
Yeah.
Even when you're even when you're talking about like spiritual systems or religion, um, no, not one of the monotheistic faiths were created or evolved from European societies. None,
Mm-hmm.
none, none of these religions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were adopted by people, but what it tells you is that as groups of people, they never evolved to the point where they came to that conclusion on their own.
Mm-hmm.
They were only exposed to that based upon our evolution and our experience as the fathers and the mothers of civilization. So them being exposed to it, they never really had an opportunity or a chance to come to their own conclusion on their own. You know what I mean? And that's
Mm-hmm.
important to understand, because for people to never evolve to the point where they can actually see this for themselves, and the only way that they see it is because of proximity or being
Mm-hmm.
exposed to it through somebody else,
Mm-hmm.
it shows you the lack of evolution within those societies. You know, no matter how great we say Rome was or Britain was, there are trees that are in West Africa that are older than their entire societies.
Yeah, yeah,
You know what
yeah.
I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yoruba culture has a society over 10,000 years old, like it's nothing,
Yeah.
which means that's 10,000 years of figuring things out and problem solving and coming to conclusions over 10,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a lot of answers in a society like that, as opposed to, you know, America not even being 250 years old,
Yeah, yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
and being looked at as if it's the new world, or it's the first world country, and it is at the peak of civilization around the world. It's like you're only 250 years old. That's
Yeah,
pretty young.
that's nothing.
That's a
Nothing.
child,
Yeah,
you know.
that's the embryo. That's not even a
Yeah,
child yet. Compared
yeah, yeah.
to 10,000 years of civilization, yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. So, you know, we're living in this kind of society. And if we're just going to solely depend upon the history and the type of content we get from this society, then we are going to be infantile in our thinking, just like the society. So
Right.
that's one thing that was beautiful about that golden era of hip hop, that we were being exposed to perspectives of life outside of what we were learning here in America,
Mm,
and being indoctrinated to believe about ourselves and one another.
right.
You know, even just the various different scholars and the books that we had access to during that time period,
Mm-hmm.
you know, was very different than a lot of the books that our youth are being exposed to today. But it allowed us to think outside of this box called America, and gave us a sense of global citizenship, and to connect with the global majority, and to recognize that we have people who look just like us, who are going through the same kind of experiences, that have some contribution to this world that's outside of America. We were
Mm-hmm.
learning that
Right.
very early.
Absolutely.
And it was because
Absolutely.
of the contributions of our elders,
Mm-hmm.
making that accessible to us, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One thing that I have asked people about, and I remember I read an article in the Source magazine when I was
Mm-hmm.
young, and it was right after 9/11, and it was talking about how after 9/11, a lot of rappers stopped using Islamic terminology in their music. Um, do you feel like there's any truth to that? And when exactly do you see a decline, whether it be a slow decline or a rapid decline, of is Islam and hip hop being in the forefront as it was in times past?
Oh, that was happening way back in the early 2000s,
Okay.
you know, right after the golden era. And you started to see people being um, people being looked at as objects, in a sense, where now they're getting these 360-degree or these 360 deals, and signing
Mm-hmm.
these contracts with these record labels. And that started happening at that time period, where
Mm-hmm.
you started to see more of an investment in music that was dumbed down, that wasn't promoting any form of cultural competence or social justice, that was just party music or gang music or violence or sex. And Boogie Down Productions had an album called Sex and Violence.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And that was a beautiful thing about our artists. They were documenting and chronicling these changes in real time, and in a lot of ways being prophetic about it.
Mm-hmm.
Rap is not pop, if you call it that, then stop. Tribe Called Quest saying
Yeah.
that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now look at the era that we're in. A lot of our artists were prophetic in that sense, you know, and then also documenting what was going on in real time. Definitely when you get to September 11th, you had people who were less likely to be defined as a domestic terrorist by using certain lexicon that would be flagged in their lyrics, right? But that was happening way back. I would say that once you really started to see the introduction of crack cocaine, which is one of the most selfish drugs that was ever invented.
Right.
You know, marijuana, heroin, these were more social drugs. People got together to deal with those type of narcotics. Crack, it was one of the most selfish drugs that ever existed. And that also reflected the mentality of a lot of people, and it destroyed a lot of families and communities because it was a sense of selfishness that the way in which that drug overtakes people, where they're willing to do anything in order to get high, you know? And it wasn't social, it was a very antisocial drug. So you look at that, which was strategically done to undermine our communities. And then you started to see people being paid for record contracts and everything else. You're starting to see labels get involved. When you start to see all of this happening, you also start to see the erosion of a sense of cultural competence. And you start to see people not speaking about things that are important anymore and just doing what the record labels expect them to do. So now you start seeing people getting paid to play. And that was happening right after the golden era, where you started to see a decline in the messages in the music, the sense of integrity in the music, the sense of originality and voice in the music. All of those things which made us who we actually are as a people started to be undermined by corporate interests, the government, agencies that saw a vested interest in just monetizing one of the elements, rap, of hip-hop culture, and to discard all of the other different elements, especially knowledge itself being the fifth element, because that's where our power was. That was our power base. So that was the primary element that was attacked. That element was so much under attack that if you were to ask people today, what are the elements of hip hop, the average person wouldn't even mention the fifth element.
Right.
They wouldn't know anything about knowledge itself, because that was the single most important element of hip hop that was primarily under attack. That was the foundation of the golden era. And they knew, and when I say they, I'm talking about corporate interests, I'm talking about the government, I'm talking about their adjacent agencies. They knew that if they could destroy that they could destroy the mentality of the people who are producing this culture. And that's exactly what you saw happen.
Right. Man. So we coming close to the 1 hour mark, so I'm going to wrap it up. But before I go, just one last question. Do you think that Islam will ever be in the forefront of mainstream hip hop again? And if not, Western Islam itself, how can we put the principles of it, the principles of knowledge itself and dignity and self-respect and family and community, how can that be put in the forefront of hip hop once again?
Well, I would say the beautiful thing about today's era with the internet and the direct-to-consumer relationship that people can create is that you do have mediums and a sense of freedom that is unprecedented. So you have...
My bad, sorry about that.
Yeah. So you have a lot of artists who are still putting out this music. You have a lot of younger artists that are still putting out music like this, but they're just not on the mainstream. You know, the challenge is not being, you have these corporate interests and, you know, people being wooed with opportunities and money to sell out, basically.
Right.
You know, and you have people who have that level of integrity. Like, I'm not going mainstream. I don't care what you try to offer me to do this ad or to be on this commercial, whatever. You have some people who have that level of integrity, but a lot of those artists you have to go and find on your own. You're not going to hear them on the radio.
Right.
You're not going to see their videos. They don't have all of this money behind them marketing and promoting. You don't have none of that, you know? So I don't look for the mainstream society to push an agenda that I know is not marketable.
Right.
And even if they're pushing something and it looks like it's social justice and it looks like it's cultural competence and it looks diverse and equitable and inclusive, it usually isn't.
Right.
It's just a facade.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So I don't look for that. I just look towards those independent artists that have that integrity and they're creating this type of music, whether it's hip hop or whether it's other different genres as well.
Right.
That's creating it, because you're dealing with a society now where you have billions and billions of dollars behind a machine that is paying people to sell out, and you have people who are willing to do it. We see it every single day.
Right.
And people who are willing to do that, I don't lose any time searching for them to evolve or to turn their life around. If they do, that's cool. If they don't, I'm more interested in these artists that understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
They have a sense of honor and respect for our history, our heritage as a hip hop culture, and they're also doing their due diligence to educate other artists and to collaborate with other artists that have that integrity, and they're putting those type of principles and values in their music.
Right. Gotcha. Well, my brother, thank you so much for your time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop now. I'm going to put the video up on YouTube, and I'm going to shoot you the link.
Okay, God. Peace. I appreciate you too. We got to do this again when we get a chance.
Absolutely. So you have a good night, man. Peace.
Peace.